Welcome, viewers and listeners, to episode number 3 of the Sharing Podcast, the platform where we're trying to create some connection and some community in this difficult time. So, hopefully, you've had a listen to one of the previous couple episodes. If not, they are available. I'll have the links in the show notes for this one, so you can head over and have a watch of those. But super excited for today's episode to start talking a bit of hoops and a bit of basketball. So my guest today is Jack Fleming. So welcome, Jack.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me. Appreciate what you're doing for society in this slower time, and looking forward to talking hoops.
Awesome. So today we're talking a little bit of sort of coaching a youth athlete in 2020. But before we dive too much into that, Jack, I might get you to just touch on a little bit your background and what you're doing in coaching at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I started off like most of us coaches as a player, not a very good one, but that pathway and love for the game led me to coaching. And what I'm doing currently is I'm coaching at Box Hill Senior Secondary, which is my old school, coaching basketball and a little bit of strength and conditioning there, as well as coaching the under 14 boys at Diamond Valley, so sort of in the youth sector.
Yep.
And then fortunate enough to be an assistant coach with our under 16s Big Metro men the past 2 years. So those are kind of the 3 hats I wear in coaching, and very lucky to do all of that.
Unreal. And recently, I think you can add to that hat is podcasting or presenting. Recently did your first, I suppose we call it a virtual clinic, I suppose, or online presentation. I think it was early this month or late last month. I think a lot of what we're going to talk today, or when I approached you to do this, my idea was sort of bouncing a little bit off that. Viewed the clinic that you gave and loved it, so I wanted to sort of piggyback a little bit off that. Can you just talk a bit to the viewers and listeners about just giving them a brief sort of background of what that clinic was and what you spoke about?
Yeah, sure. So my clinic topic for the Virtual Coaches Clinic, which is a clinic that Layson Perkins, a coach in America, has set up for basketball coaches during this quieter time. My topic was 20 lessons from a 20-something in 2020. So I was fortunate enough to just present some information on my learnings and, some of my mistakes and growth as a coach, and really lucky to be able to share some of that stuff with coaches in the internet community.
Awesome. One thing I loved from that, and you sort of you got me to really think about it as well, was you gave your coaching philosophy during that presentation. And before we dive into our chat, I think if you could just read that out for us or let us know what that philosophy is, because I think viewers and listeners will find a lot of what we're discussing today and a lot of what Jack says aligns perfectly with this philosophy. So go for it, Jack.
Yeah, so I guess I stole this idea from Guy Malloy, the head coach of the Melbourne Boomers and the New Zealand Tall Ferns, was having this overarching philosophy defined in one sentence that helps you clearly make decisions about everything you do and the overall aim of what you're trying to do as a coach. So my overarching philosophy is that the greatest success a coach can have is to orchestrate their team to autonomously become the best version of themselves. So another way of saying that is that, the aim of the coach is to almost make themselves redundant, because the players have the ability to make decisions, evaluate and review those decisions and make changes in live action without the help of the coach. So that's my overarching philosophy. It's not always perfect, but it's definitely a good aim for me that keeps me on track.
Awesome. Would you say that's how would you say that's evolved? I think probably been coaching maybe 5, 6, 7 years, something like that now. So how do you reckon that's evolved quickly before we jump in over the time?
It's definitely gone through some ups and downs. I think that how I first coach was to model my coaches, which, was definitely a great pathway. And I was fortunate enough to have some really great coaches as a young player. But throughout that time, I've been able to sort of question everything and trial and error everything that I've done. And I've gone from being maybe too controlling to, the polar opposite, being a bit too loose. And this philosophy sort of finds a balance of the two, or what has been discussed recently, what I sort of call a needs-based approach to coaching. So, what the player needs in the moment is the ultimate kind of skill of the coach.
Yep. I love that, because we're talking coaching an athlete in 2020, and the way you or I were coached as players maybe 15 years ago, although there are lessons we can take from that, it doesn't necessarily apply in today's context. So I think it is very important to understand who you're coaching and understand the time and the generation we are coaching. With that, we'll dive in. Talk a little bit about with your teams. Obviously, you coach a couple of different teams, but talk a little bit about your aims and objectives. You can start with your Diamond Valley group, and then maybe also your Basketball Victoria group.
Yeah, sure. So, with those two contexts, they're slightly different, but I do believe that you should still have a core philosophy that you focus on with your coaching. So that statement kind of rides over the top of these principles. And my number one principle, I guess, is to raise awareness of the athlete. And in that, I'm always trying to do what's best for their needs. So, sometimes their needs, we know what they need, and that's more important sometimes than what they want. In every context, I believe that it needs to be a learning environment and a teaching environment. The athlete needs to enjoy themselves, and they also need to feel that they belong in the group. And part of those concepts come from the self-determination theory, it's called, where it's about, three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose as the three things that drive motivation. But, I believe that while my under 14 boys team, they might live a little bit more in the learning stage, whereas our under 16s Vic Metro men, while that is still a core principle, in the end they're going into an intense competition where they're trying to win a gold medal. So those are the principles that I try and live around, but it is a continuum based on the context that you're in.
I love that you mentioned context. I think there's no sort of one size fits all model. Like you said, there are principles that can be translated to different platforms or different environments, but we need to be willing to adjust to the context that we're placed in. Talk a little bit about, again, you can sort of differentiate between the Basketball Vic and the Diamond Valley group, but you mentioned your younger groups are more learning. Is that skill development? Is that concept? Is it tactical? Is it all three? And then also with the Basketball Vic group as well.
Yep. So I guess the main focus with my under 14 Diamond Valley group, being 12-year-olds, is that they love the game and they want to come back. They feel like they're improving. They feel like they're part of the group, but also, they also want to go and win on a Friday night, and they like to compete. So that's really key with my under 14 group. So we probably spend a lot more time, in that learning phase at practice. And, being part of my overarching philosophy is for them to become autonomous and handle problems by themselves. I try and give them the best opportunity with support to solve problems by themselves. to support each other and hold each other accountable. Whereas with our under 16s, Vic Metro boys, they're just as capable of that, but we're in a bit of a shorter time frame. It's a bit more of a results-based context, and sometimes we have to get to the answer a little bit quicker than the long-term view that we're trying to take with our 12-year-olds.
Absolutely. I think also important for your basketball Vic group, there's people ahead of you that have laid that foundation, like what you're doing with your under 14 group. So it is, as coaches, we have to be able to work together, and it is that progression, like you said. What you're doing with your 14s group is going to help their next coach in, say, a 16s group or something like that.
Yeah, and with my under 16s, Vic Metro, I'm an assistant coach, so part of my role is to follow the lead of the head coach and take on their philosophy essentially, whereas the under 14s is a bit more of my own spin. So
yep.
You've got to do what fits in and serves your program the best you can in that moment.
Absolutely. We'll talk a little bit of training and practice, or youth training and practice. I want to share a little anecdote first. So I asked the group I coached last year, about midway through the season, I just decided to ask them all why they were playing basketball. And every one of them mentioned it was either a social factor or it was an enjoyment factor. Sometimes for kids that can go a little bit too far, and it detracts a little bit from the learning. As coaches, we can get incredibly frustrated that maybe they aren't taking it as seriously as what we seem to be in our own head. Talk a little bit about how you balance that enjoyment and that social side that the players love of training, whilst also being really productive and keeping a high effort level and the standards that you sort of expect as a coach at a youth practice.
Yeah, so I think that probably the first thing you want to do is, distinguish whether, what the aim is for your group. And usually when you ask a group, absolutely why they play is that they want to have fun, but they do usually want to have some success by the end of the year. And continuing to remind them of that can be something that can help when they're, maybe taking that enjoyment too far. But also the best way that, we can hold players accountable while, being, part of the enjoyment journey is two things for me at practice. I guess it comes back to my philosophy that if the players are thinking less than the coach at practice, how are we preparing them for the time in the game when they have to do all the thinking? And what I see as enjoyment at practice is that, the players have autonomy, so they have some control and some say, and that can really help with their buy-in and their focus. And there's two ways that I like to hold players accountable, but also stay with that fun and that enjoyment, is that when you enter any drill or, any phase of practice, you want to clearly define what success looks like in that phase. So even if it's you warm up, it might be a quick discussion with your group. Hey, what does success look like in this warm up? Well, there's lots of talk and, we're giving each other high fives, but we're also doing it at a tempo that looks like the game. And sometimes that's you telling them if they don't know, or sometimes it's a discussion, depending on where you're at. That can really make the group clear about what we're trying to achieve. And that's important when you're giving feedback. And then the second part of that for me is using what I call the rule of three, which I got from Mark Bennett. And that allows us to maintain a high standard without the coach constantly disciplining the players. So back to our aim is to make the players autonomous. The rule of one is, can a player review themselves? So can they review their own behavior in the moment? If you ask them the question, self-correct and self-manage and, control their own behavior and choices in the moment and improve. So that's the first thing. Can the player control their own state and their own behavior? then the rule of two is, can players hold each other accountable? So if we said that, we wanted the warm-up to have lots of talk and there's, a couple of players are being quiet, well, can we get one of the other players to remind them and encourage them, that this is what success looks like and this is what we want to achieve. So the rule of two is about players holding each other accountable in a positive way to keep everyone engaged. And then the rule of three is that, player can't review their own behaviour or has missed that step. The rule of two, no one's held them accountable. Now it's time for the coach to step in and help them correct their own behaviour. So I talk to my group all the time about the aim is to never get to three. We always want to be fixing it at one, fixing it at two. But to me, that's how players enjoy it, because they're always engaged and there's always a responsibility and success is always really clear for them.
Absolutely. I love two-part. Firstly, that you said you're defining what success looks like in the drill or in the practice for you. I think that helps hold people accountable and helps with that discipline. I think people can't be disciplined if they don't know what the standard is. As a coach, you've got to be able to set that standard.
I would probably just go back one step and also say that whenever we're talking about success, we're always talking about behaviour first and then the technical and tactical of the game. So whatever behaviours you value in your program, whether it's positive body language or communication or great effort, those behaviours come first before we're talking about screening angles and follow through, because in the end it's the behaviour that usually drives the results more than the technical.
Awesome. Just on your rule of three, being able to share the court with Jack earlier this season, when I'm assuming he was sort of introducing this to his team, did a great job with his questioning of trying to encourage his kids and the kids on the court to firstly think for themselves, and then secondly think with a teammate before coming to a coach or letting a coach step in. So I love that. Just quickly, if we sort of talk about from a game perspective or coaching a youth game, a lot of coaches, again, we spoke a little bit about kids taking it too far with their enjoyment at practice. Sometimes in a game, you could talk about that as turning into a bit of a mess, and coaches sometimes struggle to cope with the mess. Talk a little bit about that and how you go about that.
Sure. So, in terms of being comfortable with the mess or, guided discovery learning, I sort of believe that there has to be some mess in practice, because essentially that's what the game looks like. And I'm not saying that there's no value in on zero drills or block practice. I think they have their place, but we never want to live there. We want practice to look like the game. We want the athlete to fight for their learning, as Chris Oliver might say, and we want there to be deliberate practice, which is usually right on the edge of success and struggle. So I'm always trying to push the athletes to have to fight for their learning, because we want there to be some struggle there.
Awesome. Spoke of Chris Oliver and basketball immersion. Listening to one of his episodes a couple of weeks back where he had Jeff Van Gundy on, and he touched on, again, we mentioned context earlier, and we don't know the context completely of this, but he touched on if he could go back and coach high school age athletes, how he would pretty much run completely 5-on-5 for the whole of his practice. Talk a little bit about where you sit with, again, and context applies to this in terms of numbers and things like that. But are you very much allowing your guys to play 5-on-5 small-sided games? Where are you sort of sitting with that?
If I had, to be honest, Joel, and this might be a little bit different to some people, even with under 14s, if I had 10 players at practice, I'd probably live a little bit more in the 4-on-4, 5-on-5 space. In reference to percentages, I guess, at practice versus the 2-on-2 and the 3-on-3. But in reality of the VJBL, we usually only have 7 at practice. So, we spend most of our time in 3-on-3 anyway. But I guess my philosophy is that with the context that I'm in, there's opportunity for skill development in 5-on-5. There's the ultimate context that's the amount of space you get to play with in the game. And that's what the game looks like. And we're still going to give opportunities for decisions. We're still going to provide context with advantage, disadvantage. But to me, 5-on-5 is, where I like to live. It's where I like to teach. And I believe that player development can be done out of 5-on-5.
Awesome. How do you find that translates to then a game situation? You touched on a little bit before how letting players solve their own problems is then going to help when they get in that game setting. They've got to think for themselves. So how do you find what you put in place at practice and then translating that to the game on a Friday night?
Well, I guess my philosophy is that, you never want to expect something of a player that they haven't practiced. And just like practice, you want there to be success criteria for the game. And if the success criteria of practice can tie together with the game, that can really help your team in terms of chances of success. But being comfortable with the mess in the game for me is all about trying to have a clear mind. So what's our success criteria for the game behaviorally and technically and tactically? And we're always trying to paint the picture of what that looks like. And then we're only evaluating that for 90% of the time. We're not getting distracted by, something that we haven't asked them to do or something that they haven't practiced. We're just trying to review what we have defined success as. And that's really tough. That is a real challenge for me when we're getting, killed in a certain area of the game that we haven't defined success by. And we still want to give them tools to navigate through those problems. But in the end, we have to evaluate based on what's been pre-agreed between the coach and the players.
Love that. I think that's a constant battle that many coaches would deal with. They often go into the game with things set in their mind that this is what we want to get done. But like you said, when you're 5 minutes in and leaks start appearing, it's that tie or that wrestle in your head where it's, do I start trying to plug these or do we just persist with what we've come in talking about?
Absolutely. And I would probably say that I'm a decent practice coach, but when going back to the game tape, what I've just spoken about doesn't always add up. So, having that overarching philosophy as something that's very difficult in the end to attain, but always something that I'm aiming for. So definitely not saying it's perfect.
Talk about, do you, when you are trying to come back to your how you're defining success in the game and the things you've put in place. Talk a little bit about at Diamond Valley, are you using your assistant to help with that? And then at Basketball Vic, is your head coach using yourself to help sort of bring him back to those?
Yeah, so with the Diamond Valley stuff, we want to use the players and the rule of 3 as the first point for staying on track with our success criteria. So at any halftime, any quarter time, what we're asking them to do is only review our success criteria, behavior first, then technical and tactical, and they're not allowed to discuss anything else. then my assistant, who I'm really fortunate enough to have, Anthony Allen, who coached the group last year, so is more than capable of coaching. His job, firstly, is to, keep me on track with my with our success criteria, and then if we have a rule that if we're going to change one thing, or if we're going to take one thing apart from our success criteria, it's only allowed to be one. So, if we're getting killed in a press or something like that, it's like, okay, we were allowed to address the press break once, and then we stick with what we're supposed to talk about. So in the Diamond Valley setting, my assistant coach wants to be second to the players, but absolutely their job's to keep me on track. With our Vic Metro staff, we're fortunate enough to usually have myself and another assistant with the head coach. So we usually split responsibility between offense and defense, and whatever the focus for that game is. Success criteria often has a lot to do with scout. When we get away to our tournament, that's where we're trying to keep the players and the head coach on track with that.
Talk about, you mentioned a lot the rule of three, and obviously the first step of that being the players. I think a lot of coaches would be willing in practice to maybe take part in that, but as soon as a scoreboard comes into it on a Friday night, I think a lot of coaches would see the quick fixes. If I can just go and do it myself. Talk a little bit about how allowing players to have that opportunity for sort of problem solving and self-discovery, how that's going to help them in future success, I suppose.
Well, I guess whenever we talk about successful teams, and it's mentioned as this kind of, thing like the Spurs and the Bulls and these great teams, is that they're player-led. But we never really, we kind of think of like it as this magical thing that just, makes itself up, when if we don't provide room for it, but more important, if we don't provide a system and a mechanism, then how will they ever know? So, the aim of the team is, that the coach becomes redundant. Well, they have to have, ways and methods. They don't know. They're 12 years old. So, that ability to practice the rule of three at speed in live moments at training is going to help your group become better at it in a game. So their ability to quickly review an individual review within 10 seconds, or, using the rule of two as quickly as possible at practice, you're trying to prepare your team to do that in the game. And, there's still times where you have to step in, absolutely, especially in the game. But you do have to provide that room for them to fix it themselves, or else they'll never get there.
Awesome. Absolutely love that. When you do get to your third step and you do have to step in, inevitably there are going to be some occasions where that does happen. Talk a little bit about the way you're communicating with the players, both in a practice, and then if that changes at all in a game situation.
Sure. So the first thing I want to be able to do is manage my own state. So if I'm asking the players as part of the rule of two to deliver feedback in a positive way to each other, then I can't be an emotional wreck on the sideline or at practice, because it would be highly hypocritical. So, my aim is we want to sort of connect with the athlete and then correct their behavior or catch them doing something right. So I got this from Mike McKay, but he sort of said that we want feedback to be kind, we want feedback to be specific, and we want feedback to be solutional. So we're not living in the problem. We're not telling them that they're jogging back on defense. We want to give them the solution to the problem, so that they can move forward with it and fix it. But before that comes, we have to make sure that, I'm in a good emotional state, they're in a good emotional state, so they're ready to take in that feedback, and then we want to solve the problem. But the first thing is I want to be aware of my own state if I'm asking my athletes to do the same.
Fantastic. I think as coaches, we can only we can't expect players to do something unless we're emulating that yourself. So I love what you were talking about there. Also, you touched on a little bit all those three steps: kind, uh,
specific, and solutional.
Solutional, yeah. Absolutely. Too much of what coaches talk about often is just identifying issues without presenting a solution to that issue. And the players are never gonna learn unless we help them or guide them in that solution. And initially, we guide them in that sort of problem-solving space. What about in a one-on-one environment? How does that change at all to a team environment?
I guess I can probably provide a little bit of a framework for the rule of one in terms of self-review when it comes to giving feedback. So, when you're having a one-on-one with a player live in practice, you want to sort of, for me, I want to go through these steps as quickly as possible. Once you get halfway through the season, they've got the hang of it. But this is kind of the view is, what did you see? Did you make a commitment? Was it choice or execution? And then what would you do next time? And those are the kind of steps that I'm trying to take with a player. What did I see? I saw 2 defenders. Did I make a commitment? Yes, I drove the ball pretty hard. Okay, was it choice or execution? Well, I saw 2, so I made the pass. I made the right choice, but execution-wise, I threw a bounce pass when I should have thrown a lob. Okay, what would you do next time? I'd make a lob pass. Great, go. And that might seem like a long process, but eventually you want to get to a point in your season where you can just go, Joel, and then Joel knows that he's being reviewed and he can just bang, 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 go through those steps. That's sort of my take on the rule of one and the process that I'm trying to go through. But usually if you give them, the avenue, they'll come to the answer, even though you might know it as well. How intelligently you use your questions is really key in getting them to the solution. And I'm not saying that that's every time. And I'm not saying in a game you have time for a conversation most of the time. But, we use practice and we want to try and drill it to get quicker and be more and more efficient. So they're doing that live in action every time.
So you mentioned in that one-on-one environment, using your rule of 3 with the players or guiding them through that first rule. And you mentioned questioning. I think one thing is talk a little bit about how better questioning can lead to better answers rather than just bombarding with questions and trying to seek constant information.
Well, I think there's 2 things with that. The first thing I've noticed with my coaching when I went through a lot of self-evaluation and mentoring is when you're asking a question, are you really, especially with a player, are you really looking for their answer? Are you really interested, or are you just looking to impart knowledge? And oftentimes we ask questions, and when the player goes to answer, we jump over the top of them. Or players just giving an answer that they're trained to give. Like, what are we missing here? Talk. Oh, well, that's always an easy answer, isn't it?
Yep.
So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is, the more specific we are with the question, usually the better the answer is going to be. So, when we are very broad, we don't usually get to the answer that we want. So, we want to be very specific, I believe, especially to start with when players are uncomfortable with it. And then we also want to give that time for them to provide an answer. And we have to be interested in the answer. It can't just, if a player gives you a general answer, you need to challenge them on it. You can't just accept them to say these predetermined answers, which is usually what questioning looks like in our coaching. And it's been a process for me, not just, like always one is, does that make sense? that's one of the questions that never gets an answer. And we just say it to reassure ourselves, really.
Yeah. I think a lot of coaches would be able to relate to quite a few things that you just said there. I think as coaches, we just want to blurt out all the knowledge we've learned at, I don't know, the recent clinic or the recent book we've learned. We just want to let everyone know that we've gone and done the work. I think sometimes.
And I mean, part of going back to, being needs led as a coach, what does the player need? Well, if they don't know the knowledge, then absolutely they need to be told. If it's something new, then there's no reason why they would know. And that's your time to go and deliver the information and be direct and use your voice. But if it's something, they've done before, or you're reviewing and testing their learning, then you need to ask the question. And then after you ask the question, you need to see, has it been put into action after that question? So there's no good asking all these fancy questions from university studies if it doesn't result in change of behavior when they get back out on the floor. And that's often what we might see is players know the answer, but it's really just a predetermined answer if we don't see the change when we get back on the court. Because as coaches, we're influencers of behavior. That's what we're trying to do. So, if the question doesn't influence the behavior, then it hasn't achieved the desired result.
Lastly, Jack, you touched on a little bit with the communication, having some self-awareness about your state before you approach or before you talk with a player. Talk a little bit about maybe some tools you've used to help with that. I think I've seen you sort of recording some practices sometimes and things like that. Talk a little bit about A, if you've done that, and B, what you're looking to get out of that and what you're looking for when you review that film.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, as I talked about, raising awareness of the athlete is kind of my number one starting point. So I need to have self-awareness in my own coaching if I'm going to be the example that I want my athletes to emulate. And the way I've done that a couple of years ago was videoing my own practice, and that was more for the technical and tactical parts of practice, I guess, where I was standing, how were the athletes going, what was my feedback like. But I then took it another step, I guess it was probably this year, in strapping a GoPro to my chest and coaching practice and coaching a couple of games on that. And what that allowed me to do was really hone in on my own feedback and the response of the athletes more than the technical X's and O's of coaching. And that really helped. Firstly, when you're doing it, you want to provide a baseline for what does your coaching look like? Where are you really at in your coaching, and how are the athletes responding to that? Then secondly, once you go through the process, then you want to develop some things you're trying to improve. And just like the success criteria of your team, now you're developing a success criteria for yourself. And you can share that with your team. Okay, guys, for the next month, I'm working on trying to talk less when I deliver messages to my team. And any time that you think I'm talking too much, you can just, give me the thumbs up, and I'll understand that it's time for us to move on. So firstly, you're developing where am I at right now, and then you're developing what am I trying to improve, and just trying to stay on that success criteria and constantly reviewing that will allow you to improve before you can move on to something else. Rick Charlesworth, their famous hockey ruse coach, probably one of the most winningest records in high performance sport, talks about taking eternal vigilance, so not leaving anything to chance. And once you take that feedback, then you're trying to develop your own methods and formulas and checklists, and constantly going through those processes. The other resource to that is the book called the Checklist Manifesto, which is a book that talks about some changes in the medical world through the simple use of using checklists and and not taking things to chance. And, we sort of find that when we back our own ability, we make little mistakes. So, you're becoming aware, then you're giving yourself feedback, and then you're trying to develop your own formulas that work the best for you. That's been a process that's got a long way to go, but a really worthwhile one if you have the time and willing to invest.
Absolutely. I did that earlier this year, not on court in basketball, with my business, with my personal training business. I just set a tripod up in the corner and just film some sessions. And it's incredible when you look back. You don't even realize some of the things you say sometimes. So it is go on.
The amount of times I said all right would have been in the high 70s, and the first time I videoed myself. So
yeah,
you never become self-aware unless you watch it back on tape, and it can be quite painful, but worth.
I think it's a great place to start, though. Like Jack said, it can be painful that first time you sit back and watch it, but I think it is a great place to start. Is actually filming even just a conversation. Doesn't have to be a full practice, even just a conversation, and getting a bit of an idea of not just the verbal but the body language as well, and things like that, because it was a huge eye-opener for me.
I would probably suggest that the next step to that would be getting someone else to review that tape, and I wouldn't go to it before you watch it yourself, but I definitely think I did some work with Mark Bennett, watching my stuff, but just having, an outside eye on that after you've reviewed your own is a really good way of doing it too.
Yep. Always good to get fresh eyes on it. We're coming to an end. Was there anything you wanted to touch on before we wrap up? I will also get you to, we'll put it in the show notes, but if you can just also let people know where they can find you. Jack is also, we didn't touch on at the start, a blogger as well, so puts up some fantastic information on there. So any last words from you, Jack, and also just where people can find you?
I guess probably my last message to coaches would be to try and, develop a philosophy that's true to yourself and what you believe in as a starting point, and be willing to change that over time. But, have a lighthouse, have a direction that you're heading with your coaching, because people who have something to aim at usually end up there. So, as a coach, whether it's a PT or a sports coach, I think that's a great place to start, is just having a philosophy. In terms of my contact, probably the best way is Twitter. So my Twitter is at Jack_Fleming 1. And then my blog is medium.com/@FlemingJack1995.
I think Jack would agree as well. There's some great stuff on his blog, not just for basketball coaches. I think there's stuff that apply to many different fields. So I strongly recommend people checking that out and flicking through. How many articles are you up to now?
100 and a lot.
A lot. So flicking through and finding something that suits you, because I think there is quite a bit in there for a few different environments. Thanks again for coming on. Very much appreciate your time and giving up your time to help out some basketball coaches in this time where we can't be on the court. So thank you very much, Jack.
Thanks, mate. What you're doing at the moment is, really powerful, and whether it's reaching one person or 100, it's going to have a big impact on those people that listen. So thanks for what you're doing for coaching and society in general at this time. There's going to be so much to learn from these lessons for yourself and for everyone listening.
Absolutely. For viewers and listeners, so episode 4 will be out on Monday. and that'll be with Cam Rigby, who is the business owner and head coach at Prime Athletes Australia. So we're talking a little bit of culture and creating a culture in the weight room. So really looking forward to that. Can't wait for that one. Stay safe, take care, and we'll see you next time.